sorry. It was supposed to have a song, but it didn't play.
It's okay.
Y'all know the song anyway.
Alright, so you guys know what body habitus is by now. It determines the shape, position, and movement of the internal organs. If you're hypersthenic, your lungs and all your organs will sit up a little bit higher. And if you're asthenic, tall and skinny, your lungs will tend to kind of be elongated and extend further down. And we have a picture. You can kind of see the difference between hypersthenic, asthenic, hyposthenic, and asthenic. So with experience, you will know exactly how to position your IR for different kinds of patients according to their body habitus.
So go back a second on that. So I want y'all to focus as well, because we spent a lot of time in the last chapter looking at the abdominal organs. But of course, what are we talking about now, guys? Thorax. So the two organs that we are mainly focused on when it comes to body habitus in this chapter are going to be the heart and the lungs. And I want you to really look closely at how those heart and lungs change shape, which is between those four body habituses. So on the hypersthenic, of course, the main thing that we're going to look at and see a difference on an X-ray is going to be the lungs. They're going to be very wide. Now, based on that, and what you guys have started practicing in lab, when you have a patient that's very wide, what would be the best orientation for your cassettes?
Crosswise.
Oh, I heard both on that.
Landscape.
I want y'all to get landscape out of your vocabulary, because it's the actual vocabulary is crosswise. And landscape is what the old book used to say, but crosswise is the modern term that they're using for that. Both mean the same thing. That would be a crosswise cassette. Why do we need it to be crosswise? Because the lungs are so wide, and we're in danger of cutting them off. Also, look how wide and round the heart gets. Now, sthenic, that's your average body shape. The general rule for sthenic body patients is for males, you still want to do crosswise because males are typically more broad. Females, you want to stick with your lengthwise cassettes. That's for your sthenic, your average body habitus. Now, asthenic, what's that referring to? Are very skinny, right? What happens to the lungs and hearts? They're very elongated. Therefore, what would you do for both male and females of that body habitus on your cassette? Lengthwise, right? And a lot of times you're going to do two X-rays because they're so long, you have to do an upper and a lower. And then your hyposthenic is going to be very close to your average size. Same rule, males crosswise, females lengthwise in general for that hyposthenic. Does that make sense? What's your percentages on those, by the way? Let's review. Hypersthenic is what percentage of the population?
5.
How about sthenic?
50.
Asthenic?
10.
And hyposthenic? Very good. Very good. Good.
Mr. Tuan uses portrait and landscape.
I know, that's what Bontrager used to say. I've been trying to get, have update his vocabulary.
So the brown portion shows both heart and lungs together.
The what?
Right?
I'm sorry?
When we say that it's showing elongated lungs, so it's showing elongated heart.
Correct.
There's only one figure there. So what would we say? Is it an elongated lung or is it an elongated heart?
Both.
Elongated heart and lung.
So hypersthenic, the lungs and the heart are widened. Sthenic, it's just normal. Asthenic, they're very long. And then hyposthenic, they're also slightly elongated.
Both of them.
Correct.
Both of them.
Correct.
So which one would be skinnier, the asthenic or the hypotonic?
Asthenic's will be your skinniest. Yes. Go ahead.
Landmarks. We learned about landmarks in last week's lab. What are the two landmarks that we find for a chest X-ray?
Excellent.
Receiving prominence and the
C7.
And the
T7.
C7 and what was
and
it?
T7, yes. So vertebral prominence is your C7, and we go about 7 inches down, we have our T7. And if we're doing an AP chest, we use the jugular notch and the imaginary nipple line, or the axilla, which is going to put us at T7. And we can also use the xiphoid tip whenever we're doing the diffuse position to make sure we're in the central, in the mid-sagittal plane. Okay?
Ma'am, jugular notch is between 1 and 2 or is it at 1?
It's at the level of T2. Mm-hmm.
And just make note, guys, when you see landmarks, that word topographic, I don't know if we've said what that is yet. That's just another way of saying landmarks. Topography refers to landmarks.
Alright, so we're going to be talking about the thoracic cavity. What do you guys think that is?
Just one.
So a cavity basically means a space or a hole, and that is what houses our lungs and our heart. So the cavity is bounded by the walls of the thorax, and it extends from the superior thoracic aperture to the inferior thoracic aperture, and right below it is the diaphragm, which separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. So there is an opening at the top of the lungs and an opening at the bottom, and that is where the structures, important structures like the arteries, the vessels, the esophagus, etc. come out of. So there's one at the top and one at the bottom. There's a picture to describe what I just said. So we have the lungs on both sides. We have the mediastinum in the middle between both of the lungs. And the mediastinum houses the heart, the aorta, the esophagus, everything except the lungs and the pleural space.
Is the mediastinum just a fancy way of saying the middle of the sternum?
Exactly. It's the area, and it's that middle area right here. It encompasses everything in this location.
Yeah.
It's your mediastinum.
Okay.
Sternum is a part of it, yes. It's basically the anterior portion of it, but it's all that midsection of the thoracic cavity.
Doesn't really mean this center of the sternum.
No, it does not. It's that particular area. So when we say mediastinum, we're talking about everything. Basically, if you follow the outline of the heart, that's your mediastinal area. So everything that falls in that circular area is considered mediastinum. We're going to break it down for a few slides in a minute, so.
Alright, so once again, the thoracic cavity has your lungs, the heart, the organs of the respiratory, cardiovascular, and lymphatic systems, the inferior portion of the esophagus, and the thymus gland. I'm pretty sure that's going to be a test question.
That's a great test question. The one people forget the most is that thymus gland. Very obscure gland found in your chest on the anterior portion. Very hard to image. Does anybody know off the top of their heads how you would image a thymus gland? It's on the chest section. You're thinking of the thyroid. Does anyone know how you would be able to see a thymus gland in imaging?
Sternum? No. Would you use,
It's a different modality.
CT?
CT could be one.
MRI?
PET scan could be one.
Ultrasound?
Nuclear medicine. Nuclear medicine really lights it up.
Mm.
If you've ever seen a nuclear medicine scan, they're very colorful. You can light that thymus gland up. I'm off subject. My apologies.
Alright, so the thoracic cavity has 3 separate sub-chambers. One is the pericardial, which houses the heart and all of the structures associated with the heart. And then we have our right and left pleural cavities for our right and left lung. And the mediastinum, which is the area in between both of the lungs, it's what separates both of the pleural cavities. And it contains all of your thoracic structures except your lungs and the pleura.
Anyone that's read ahead, you know what the pleura are.
I was about
Covering
to
up
ask.
the
Oh,
lungs.
sorry.
It's like, anyone know what the pleura is?
The covering of the lungs.
Yes, exactly. It's a very thin, clear sac that covers the lungs. It is also lubricated by fluid, and there is an inner pleura and an outer pleura, which we'll get into in just a few slides. So this is another look at the thoracic cavity without the ribs. So it has both of our lungs, it has our heart and all of the structures, and as you can see the diaphragm. What happens to the diaphragm when you take a breath in?
It goes down,
down.
expands.
Exactly.
The cavity expands.
You know, let's further that because this is actually a registry question, which you just brought up about the diaphragm. So y'all just said the diaphragm flattens when you breathe in, correct? Why does that happen?
Because the air comes in, so it pushes the diaphragm down, so.
You're on the right
The
track.
air?
Air fills the lungs, so as the lungs expand, the diaphragm flattens to allow room for them to expand. So what would be the reverse of that?
The air will go out, the diaphragm will
Expiring.
rise.
Diaphragm does what? Contracts or moves up to do what? Push the air out. Push the air out. Very important concept there, guys.
Yeah, so it's a muscle that goes down and back up, and it helps the lungs expand when you inspire.
We generally we always go test question.
This clicker does not want to work with me.
That's a little. I think the battery's a bit more.
All right, so respiratory system. What's the purpose of the respiratory system?
Breathing.
It's right there. Exchange of gaseous substance between the air and the blood. So we have 4 parts of the respiratory system. We have our pharynx, which becomes a larynx once we go distally. We have our trachea, our right and left bronchi, and of course our lungs. Another test question.
I'm giving all my secrets away.
Yes.
Well, yeah, keep it coming.
All right, so what is the trachea? What?
Can we just go back?
Oh,
Yeah, speak up.
sorry.
Yeah, hold on.
Just say
Oh,
we're
Yeah, I'm
going-
sorry.
Anytime we're going fast, let us know. We'll slow it down.
I think the parts and the purpose will be on the test.
Everything's fair game. I'm just saying that.
Just let me know when you guys are ready.
While y'all are writing, what's the larynx house? What's in the larynx?
The
Voice
voice
box.
box.
Oh, very good. The voice box. Your vocal cords on that's correct. By the way, it's pharynx and larynx, not pharynx and larynx,
Oh, yeah,
which a lot of people like to pronounce it that way.
that gets on my nerves.
Me too. It drives me nuts. It's bronchi, not brunchy. I've heard some weird pronunciations. So.
What's the singular, sir?
What's the what?
What is it? This is the bronchi, is the singular or the plural?
There's a right and
There's
left.
two.
Go each side.
This is the plural, right? So what's the singular word for it, sir?
Bronchus.
Bronchus.
Are we ready to move on?
Sure.
All right, so the trachea. It is a muscular tube with 16 to 20 C-shaped how do you say that word?
Cartilaginous.
Rings. And it is 1/2 inch in diameter and 4.5 inches long. And the posterior aspect of the trachea is flat. So in the front we have our C-shaped rings, and in the back it's flat. And ding ding ding, test question. It lies anterior to the esophagus.
So that means it's what? Is it in front of or behind the esophagus?
Front of.
Front of. Which is why you get, as Shahid was sharing, a tracheotomy, where you can cut right there, insert the tube.
Just think of those people with the tubes in their neck. The trachea has to be in the front for that to happen.
So what's another way Mr. Donahue can trip you up on that question? I want y'all to think critically for a second, because I've seen this on the registry. Think about that for a second. What's another way I can ask a question on that?
What's behind the trachea?
What is located posterior to the trachea? Yes. What anatomy is located
So
posterior? to
that's the
trachea?
larynx, sir.
That would be the esophagus.
That's the esophagus.
Always think of a way that question can be asked in reverse. Hint, hint.
Next question.
Right, moving on. So, at
Strong on that one.
the trachea extends down into the, where do you think it extends down to? Yes. And the carina is a hook-like process on the last cartilage of the trachea. It bifurcates or it divides at the level of T4 or T5, and that is what we call the carina. And we have the right primary bronchus going into the right lung, and we have the left primary bronchus going into the left lung. Are we putting a star? Oh.
Yeah. That's the important point. That bifurcation is called, the point of it being the bifurcation being called the carina and at what level it's found. Very
Mhm.
important.
So the question could be worded as, where or what is the name of the junction where the trachea bifurcates into the right and left primary bronchus? The answer is, I feel like I'm helping out here.
We appreciate it.
So we have a clear picture of the trachea with the C rings in the front like we discussed. Where's my laser? And right there we have our carina, and as you can see, it's dividing into the right primary bronchus and the left primary bronchus.
Just that spot is called carina, ma'am.
Yes, right there.
Yeah, right where it splits.
You said
And it's actually the
4, 05.
cartilage, right, sir?
T4,
Well, it's
T5.
the trachea itself, not necessarily the cartilage. The cartilage is those C rings. See those little white rings on there? That's made of cartilage.
So true or false, the C rings are on the anterior and posterior side of the trachea.
True, oh no, C is only half,
Yes.
semicircle. Oh.
Posterior
makes
side
sense.
is flat.
I like that question. I hadn't thought of that one, that's a good one.
Wait, what'd you say?
I said true or false, the trachea has C rings that are on the anterior and posterior side.
It's just the anterior.
False, right? Because so it's a C rings is only half.
And we can see the pleural space here. What is a pleura again?
The covering of the lung.
It is a clear sac that lines the lungs.
Clear sac that lines the lung.
Yes. We have two pleural cavities, therefore two pleura. Alright. So once again, we can see the trachea coming down, and what is the junction? Carina is dividing into the right and left bronchus. We have our larynx, also known as our voice box, and it is also called a thyroid cartilage.
Ma'am, I have a question there.
Mhm.
Can you say the larynx is the same as the thyroid cartilage, or thyroid cartilage is inside the larynx?
I believe the thyroid cartilage sits in front of the larynx.
Correct, it's basically like a little covering on top of it in the front.
Yes, so there is two lateral sides to the thyroid cartilage, and in the front it is joint, it makes a point that we call the Adam's apple, or the laryngeal prominence. That is at the level of C4, usually. And then right below it, we have the thyroid gland.
And it's only in men that the Adam's apple is like actually
Sticks out.
prominent where you can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've seen some females that have slight Adam's apple
Yeah,
too.
sometimes.
Ma'am, which one was Adam's apple you said?
So the thyroid cartilage has two lateral sides, and in the middle, it becomes a point that we call the laryngeal prominence, or the Adam's apple.
Typically on males, you can see it protruding up the neck.
And that's the area where you would normally find the thymus gland. It sits right on top of the heart and in front of the trachea.
So before she proceeds, I want y'all to look as well at each bronchus, the left and the right bronchus. And I think this is on the next slide, if I'm not mistaken, but I want y'all to comment on what's the main difference you see between those two sides.
One shorter than.
One has two lobes and the other has three.
Multiple things. Someone said shorter versus longer. Correct. One has, what were you saying?
Two lobes? Or am I wrong?
Well, we haven't talked about what those are yet.
Oh,
Terminal
okay.
ends, 2 terminal ends versus 3.
Yeah.
Correct. That's very important to know, the difference between those sides. And we're gonna detail it in the next few slides, but make note that those do differ between sides. It's very important.
So what,
The thymus gland sits in
that
front of
the
the
difference
trachea,
between the two
right on
sides
top
of
of the
the
heart.
trachea.
The bronchus. So the
The
left
bronchus.
bronchus is longer, the right bronchus is shorter. The left bronchus has 2 termination points, the right has 3. And that corresponds with how many lobes we have in the lungs, which you'll see as we, I'm spoiling. Spoiler alert.
I mean, it is your PowerPoint.
Spoiler
It's
alert.
fine.
Where does the, cause I just had bifurcate.
The bifurcation is the carina.
Oh, okay.
So the bifurcation point of the trachea is the carina. Good question.
And that happens at T4?
Approximately T4 to T5. There are variances between people. You know, anatomy does differ between patients, but you know, on average, is what it's talking about. Not responding?
Not responding. All right, so we're gonna look at the bronchus in more detail. The right primary bronchus, as someone observed, is shorter, wider, and more vertical than the left. And this is very important because the right primary bronchus is shorter, it makes it easier for foreign bodies to enter the right bronchus, and therefore a lot of infections you'll find in the right lung. Oops, I didn't- So you can see this is a posterior view. So we're looking at the lungs from the back. The right primary bronchus looks shorter and more vertical. And the left one is slightly longer and thinner. Any questions? All right, so these are the subdivisions of the bronchial tree. We have our primary bronchi, which we just talked about, right and left. We have our secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, and then all of that eventually ends up in little bronchioles. That's why the lungs sometimes look like they have little tree branches in them. And the bronchioles end in terminal bronchioles, which further has one more thing called alveolar ducts, which has alveolar sacs, and within them we have millions of alveoli. Anyone know the purpose of the alveoli?
Increases the surface area. It increases the surface area to absorb the oxygen.
Correct. So the purpose of alveoli, test question, is to exchange gaseous substances between the lungs and the bloodstream. So when we take a deep breath in, it goes into our lungs and our bronchuses and bronchioles and eventually the alveoli, sends oxygen into the bloodstream and then gets rid of CO2. So this is a look at the carina from internally. Once again, the point that it bifurcates is the T4, T5. It splits into the right and left bronchus.
I got a great question for y'all. On that picture on the right, where you're showing the carina sliced, what kind of body plane is that?
It's
What kind of slice is that?
it's a horizontal,
Sagittal.
Horizontal, axial.
like this.
Because that's basically
Oh,
like looking
come
like
on.
this. Look at it
Is it
closely.
like
You went
this?
like this.
Yes.
Cut it in half. We're looking down into it. That's the inferior portion. The superior portion will be over here.
Oh,
See that?
Lord.
I don't know. That's a great test. That's a really good question. I told you, it all builds on itself. I
What was the question, sir?
mean, what kind of slice was that?
Okay, so the alveolar ducts end up in alveolar sacs. And these walls of sacs are lined with what we just talked about, alveoli. And the purpose is to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide from the bloodstream. And there's millions of alveoli in each lung. And they communicate with the nerves and arteries. So we have our primary bronchus, we have our secondary and tertiary bronchioles, and then that leads to our alveolar ducts. And at the end of that, we have our alveolar sacs, which contain all of the alveoli.
So ma'am, what's alveolus?
I believe it's the group.
It's one single.
One single is alveolus,
Now, look at the little bubbles. So you have a group of alveolar sacs. A singular bow would be an alveolus.
So that's singular of alveolars.
Right.
Whereas a group of them, like two or more, would be just alveoli, right?
Or alveolar sac. Yeah. They're kind of interchangeable. And just because this diagram doesn't point out very well, guys, just to show you what we're talking about with the the primary bronchus versus secondary. Here's your trachea. Then you have your two primary. You see how it branches further and further? This would be your secondary. And then the very end would be your tertiary. So main trachea, primary bronchus, secondary bronchus, tertiary bronchus, and then the very end of it, where it terminates, is your terminal bronchiole. Does that make sense?
Yes.
That's a lot of words.
It is.
I need a blank piece of paper. You know what? Let me draw.
That'd be one of those things I would write on my sheet before I took my test, one of those little diagrams.
This might be a diagram that we might need to label, sir.
And then there's kind of what I was talking about a little bit there as well. Same concept.
They kind of look like grape.
They do look like grapes.
My clicker's not working, sorry.
Oh,
All right, so now we finally get to talk about lungs, our organs of respiration. The superior portion of the lung is called the apex, and it almost always reaches above the clavicles. The inferior portion is called the base, which rests on the diaphragm. And our base of the lungs, they extend lower in the back and our sides, more so than in the front. And then our costophrenic angles are the very corner of the lungs on our sides. We'll look at an x-ray in a second.
Ma'am, what do you mean by costophrenic angle? Is it just a name or is it some?
Yes, that's the name of the very corner of the lungs on the sides. Right above the diaphragm.
Oh, I see.
let me show you. I'll draw you a picture on the board because I don't like the way it worded it in the textbook there. Because the book says sides for costophrenic angles, but for me it's one of the corners. Pins up. So, got lungs, and don't make fun of my drawings. I don't draw very well.
That's pretty good.
Okay, so the parts we just named: apex, base, and costophrenic angles. Apex is the very top. A for apex. Apex is singular, apices is plural. I talk about both. You'll hear texts always talk about the apices of the lungs. Clip the apices. This bottom portion is kind of curvy and flat. That's your base, or bases, plural. And see how each lung comes to a point on the sides? It's an angular shape. That's your costophrenic angles. So apices, base, costophrenic angles on the bottom corners. And those costophrenic angles, every one of us that's been a tech can attest, that's going to be your arch nemesis. Those angles are always so easy to clip. If you clip the costophrenic angles, and you won't see techs always do this, you need to repeat that x-ray, because those angles could contain some kind of pathology on those lungs that we need to make sure the radiologist is reading. So apices, base, and costophrenic angles. 3 very important portions of the lungs that you need when you're evaluating if your x-ray is passable to give to the radiologist.
So,
Yeah.
what do you mean by clip? Where you lose?
So when I say clip, that means you took an x-ray and maybe you centered too high and you cut the bottom of it off on the image. So clipping means you're missing
Leaving it out,
anatomy.
the
You clip the
bicep.
anatomy on the image. Yeah.
So, the right lung is shorter than your left lung because of our liver pushing up on the right lung. And the right lung is also broader than the left. And of course, as we said earlier, when we breathe in, our lungs move inferiorly, pushing down on the diaphragm, and they move superiorly when we during expiration. And you're going to see this question about the right lung all the time.
Yes.
It's shorter and broader because the liver is pushing at it.
The liver pushes up on the right lung, making it shorter than the left.
So a test question would be like true or false, the heart presses on the right lung and making it shorter than the left.
That's a pretty good one.
Yes.
I like that question.
Giving him ideas.
Well, yeah, that is, she's absolutely right. They do bring that point up quite a bit of the liver pushing up on the right lung, because you'll see on every x-ray it does look shorter than the left.
So I have a question. Liver is quite big, right?
It's
So
very-
the
it's
whole
very
of the
big.
liver pushes at it, or portion of the liver pushes at it?
The superior portion of liver, superior
Superior
portion.
It kind of extends upwards, so it pushes up on that right lung.
So is the liver bigger than the lungs? No.
Is it what?
Is the liver bigger than the lungs? No.
Depends. Yeah, I
Like
mean,
you
usually your
difference
lungs are
of
bigger,
different
but
sizes according to your stomach, you know.
It depends. The liver is very large. It's not working. Sorry. Still making you need a clip.
Yeah, right there. So, each of the lung is enclosed in a double-walled serous membrane sac called the pleura. And the inner layer is called the visceral pleura, and the outer layer is the parietal pleura. So each of the lungs has its own sac with 2 layers. Inner layer is visceral, outer layer is parietal. The right lung has 3 lobes, very important,
Star.
and the left only has 2.
There's some little word facts for you. You know, I always say look for key words. Visceral literally means inner. Parietal means outer. So when you see the word inner, that relates to visceral. Outer relates to parietal. They literally mean the same thing. These terminologies.
So just to give you a quick summary, the right lung is shorter than the left lung. It has 3 lobes, while the left has 2 lobes.
And why does it have 3 lobes on the right side?
That's where
What's the reason for that?
Say it again. Say your question again.
Why does the right lung have 3 lobes?
It has more organs on that side.
And what are those organs called?
It has three something.
It's three something, correct.
Okay.
The lung has
What,
three
what were we
something.
talking about before?
Oh, the secondary and the tertiary.
Oh, the
You're on the right track.
trachea.
What's the word I'm looking for? There's three what? On the right
Primary. No.
Bronchi.
Three
Bronchi.
secondary
Oh.
bronchi, correct. Three secondary bronchi means the three lobes. Thus, on the left side, why is there only two?
The part.
Because there's
Two secondary.
two secondary bronchi.
Okay.
3 seconds.
Or write that down.
You said the three side have the. I mean, the right side have the three
Three secondary bronchi, thus three lobes. The lobes correspond with the number of secondary bronchi.
Okay. So there's the apex of the lungs right at the top. And our costopharynx angles right here in this corner. And the right lung has three lobes, superior, middle, and inferior. And the left has just the superior and inferior.
Boy, I get a million questions on that.
What is a lobe per se? Is it just like, is it an actual section and you can see?
It's a division of the lung.
Okay.
Because the lobes are separated by fissures.
Okay.
Do they need to know the fissures?
Yes, yes they do.
So we have the horizontal fissure here separating the superior lobe from the middle lobe. And then we have the oblique fissure separating the middle from the inferior.
Now, those aren't very easily visualized on X-ray. Every once in a while you can really make them out, but you still even know that those lungs are divided by those fissures. It divides up those lobes, splits them into their different sections.
And something that's unique to the left lung is that it has this concave area called the cardiac notch. What do you think sits over there?
The heart.
So it's perfectly made to have the heart sit right there in that space.
Ma'am, oh, I see.
So that's called a cardiac notch. Another test question.
And that's a great thing to keep in mind, guys, because even though we have two lungs, there's quite a few differences between the two, right? They have their own unique characteristics when you look at them more closely. You should even know those different differences between the two sides.
I mean, technically, the heart sits in the center of the body, but it protrudes more to the
Towards the
Correct.
left, exactly.
So we have to know that cardiac notch is on the left lung because
Yes.
the heart sits on it. And the
Yes.
heart is on the left side of the lung.
We
No,
have
the heart is on the left side of the body.
demonstration right here. So if we take the heart away, you can see there's a little concave space here on the left lung. That's called the cardiac notch. Because the heart extends a little bit to the left, so it sits perfectly in that little space. Yes.
Everything does fit like a puzzle. It really does.
Whoever made us did a great job.
I'm telling you.
Thank you, Jesus.
Alright, any questions? Quick, please.
Oh, sorry.
Alright, now we're going to move into the neck. So the neck is divided into posterior and anterior portions, so front and back. The front side has our thyroid and our parathyroid glands, and the larger part of the submandibular glands. And we'll look at each of those closely in the next slides.
By the way, if you look on that diagram, see how that thyroid card is going up to a point? See what I'm talking about? That's that Adam's apple we were talking about, that prominence, which is much more prominent on males typically.
So is that the point where you're pointing it back?
Yes. And what's another name for your Adam's apple?
You just told me.
Thyroid cartilage is more laterally. That's not really the point.
thyroid glands is called the other name for thyroid gland is the laryngeal cartilage gland.
No, another name for Adam's apple is the laryngeal prominence. So that's the point where both of the lateral sides of the thyroid cartilage meet and it sticks out in your throat. You can prominently see it in males versus females.
Madam Adam apple saw laryngeal cartilage.
Laryngeal prominence.
So the actual anatomical term is laryngeal prominence, but the layman's term would be Adam's apple. So when you're describing it to a patient, you probably say Adam's apple. If you're describing it to a colleague or a doctor, you want to say laryngeal prominence.
That's the fun feeling of my neck actually. Like I can feel my hands on the best cartilage, like here that I'm feeling.
Yes. And this will be important whenever we learn how to position for your C-spine, because you'll be centering on the laryngeal prominence. So, your thyroid gland has two lateral lobes. Let me go back to this picture. Up. There's your thyroid gland. It has two lateral lobes, one on this side, one on the other side. And in the middle, where they meet, this area right here is called the isthmus of the thyroid. And we have the parathyroid glands on the top and the bottom on either side. So each side of the thyroid gland has the associated parathyroid glands on the superior side and the inferior side.
Did you have this picture in the book, ma'am?
Yeah.
Yes.
92.
92.
So just like I said earlier, the thyroid gland has two lateral lobes and it's connected at the lower thirds by a narrow median portion called the isthmus. And it lies in front of the upper part of the trachea.
Sorry.
Mhm. And that's a lot of information. But this is mostly memorization, right?
On the anatomy side, typically you're going to rely on memorization, but always remember, be mindful of what are the unique characteristics of the anatomy. Like we talked about the differences between the two lungs. How does anatomy lie in proportion to each other? We're talking about directional terms. We talk about lateral, medial, anterior, posterior, things like that. All that terminology we just learned in chapter 1 and 2 is going to apply to how that anatomy is located within the body. Example, talking about directional terms. What are the costophrenic angles in relation to the apices? Are they?
They're distal, sir.
The distal.
I heard two correct answers. They can be inferior, which they are. Apices are superior, angles are inferior, but also distal. They're distal to the apices. Y'all see that? We'll overlap on the terminology. So that's all those words we've been talking about. When we get to bones, all those words we just talked about before as well, we're going to start coming up like your coracoid processes, your tubercles, all that wonderful stuff you're going to see as we move forward more and more. But always be thinking about directional terms as well. We like to ask questions on how is that anatomy situated in the body in relation to the directional terms. Once again, trachea anterior to the esophagus, esophagus posterior to the trachea. Thyroid gland is anterior to the trachea. The trachea is posterior to the thyroid gland. You see that?
So, because is this the old time Pac-Man or is this a new character?
Oh, that's Super Mario.
Super Mario.
Yes. Super Nintendo. It's my favorite. Oh,
These were game, right?
love it.
Okay, so the parathyroid glands, where does it sit?
On top of the thyroid, I'm sure.
Yes, on top of the thyroid. There's two actually. There's superior portion and an inferior portion. So there's 2 on each side for the respective thyroid glands, superior and inferior. Situated one above the other on the posterior aspect of the adjacent lobe of the thyroid gland. Wow, that's a lot of words.
So you got two
So
types of
basically that just means the thyroid gland, it's separated on both sides by the isthmus, correct? And on each side of the thyroid gland, there we have the parathyroid glands, one right on top and one on the bottom. I hope that makes sense.
So there are 4
Here's
parathyroids.
a picture coming up.
Ma'am, there are 4 parathyroids. One on the top and on the bottom on each side.
Correct, they come in
Yes.
pairs, there's a right and left. There's 2 superior, 2 inferior, left and right.
So we have our
There's 4
thyroid
total.
gland here,
2 superior, 2 inferior.
one on the right side, one on the left side, connected by the isthmus. And on top, we have the superior parathyroid and the inferior parathyroid.
So there's only one thyroid gland on each side, but they have the top superior.
There's one thyroid gland, it contains 4 parathyroid glands. There's 2 superior and 2 inferior. You're only looking at it from one side here. You can't see the other side.
So this is the right side of the thyroid gland and the left side is behind. In the middle, it's connected by the isthmus. And our thyroid gland sits right below our thyroid cartilage and in front of the trachea.
So is that damaged whenever you damage the thyroid gland?
There's a hyoid bone?
Yeah, whenever you damage.
It could be, depends on, actually, that's something I want to talk about, the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone actually kind of floats right there, floats around your neck, on the anterior portion. There's a very significant point about the hyoid bone when it comes to, when they're looking at cause of death with a lot of people, especially suicidal cases. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Typically, if you are death from hanging, they look to see if that hyoid bone's been fractured to confirm that it was a suicide or death by hanging. You usually look at that hyoid bone.
Or strangulation.
Strangulation. Somebody
Typically,
could.
well, like strangulation by the hands, not so much. It's more so related to like a hanging type injury. Because usually, when someone goes through a hanging, if you ever seen it on shows and TV, which is a little bit dramatized, they usually fall. And when they fall, it makes a snapping noise. So typically, the hopes are that the neck is going to snap and it's going to be an automatic death. Otherwise, they die slowly by strangulation. Either way, that rope typically will cause that hyoid bone to become fractured. That's what they'll usually look at when they look at the cause of death. They can say death by hanging through strangulation or automatic death through the neck being snapped.
Ms. Vanya,
Yes.
isthmus is that bone where it bifurcates, right, ma'am?
It's not a
Or
bone,
carina is the bone that where it bifurcates.
the trachea.
Trachea bifurcates at carina,
Yes.
but not at isthmus.
No.
There was isthmus you said, right?
Isthmus is the area where the thyroid gland joins in the front. So the thyroid gland has 2 lobes, one on this side and one on the left
The
side.
2 lobes of the thyroid gland
Yes.
join at the isthmus.
Isthmus, yes.
Thanks, ma'am.
And what is the location of the thyroid cartilage?
C4, C5.
Yep. Y'all learned something from me.
Yeah.
Should we stop here? Or,
Yeah, I think it's a good stopping point for me. Because the pharynx and larynx is sort of laid out like the body and stuff, so good stuff.
So it's T4, T5 for the thyroid gland.
Yes.
T correct.
C4.
Yes.
C4, C5.
superior inferior on the right side and superior inferior on the left side? Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And so C4 and C5 is probably this.
I'm so confused.
For C4 and C5, how is your
C4 and C5 are the thyroid glands.
The C4, it's like C for cat 4. Then it's not T, right?
Yeah, you said T just now.
T for the thymus, C for the thyroid.
Time, oh, I see. T,
I guess.
T4, T5 for the thymus.
C4 for the thyroid. Two glands.
Well, the thymus is also cancer.
Correct. So guys, what should you be doing? You need to review this anatomy, this information. This is all going to be showing up from here on out. Also start reading ahead. We got a lot more anatomy to go over. Read ahead and familiarize yourself with the diagrams and the wording. And then we will be moving on to probably pathology on the next lesson as well. But your next test will have what's called an image review exam. Now, what's an image review exam? That's going to be a separate exam from your multiple choice one like you just took. You'll take 2 tests on the same day. You'll have your usual multiple choice, but you'll also have the image review exam, which will have x-rays, and you'll have and diagrams like we saw, and what you'll have to do is click on the anatomy I'm asking you to click on. So, for example, let's say I had a diagram that looked just like this. And I said, on the question, please click on the laryngeal prominence. You move your cursor you move your cursor right here and click, and it's going to put a little cursor on it. So you'll be doing, that's called hotspot exams. You'll be labeling the anatomy via diagrams and x-rays. Because what we're going to do in the next lesson as well is we're not just learning diagrams, we're going to apply this to actual x-rays. So we're learning the diagrams so we can find it on the x-rays themselves. So all this anatomy we're talking about, you'll see on your chest x-rays. That make sense? So
And there'll be 2 different grades.
there'll be 2 different grades, yes.
So even though we're not, as a technologist, we're not supposed to read the x-ray, but we have to
But you'll
know
know
it.
how to.
But we have to
So
know
we're
it.
not allowed to read and interpret x-rays, but you'll know how to.
But
You're gonna see
because-
stuff, yeah. You'll know, I'm not joking, you'll know more than some of those doctors. You will. You're gonna be anatomy experts, believe me. All right, guys, any questions?
When is our test?
We're really looking ahead. It'll probably be moved because you guys have a CPR class on the day out of the syllabus. So we'll talk about it. Plus we're a day behind because of that power outage, so we'll see. It's variable.
About when, sir? Just for an idea.
About when? I don't know yet. Just have to see how far we get.
In the future.
In the future, yes.
In the next week, right? Not.
Good question.
Is it going to be on Exemplify?
Yes. And we'll do a little practice hotspot exam so you guys can know what to expect as well. I'll make a little mock exam for you guys to test out.
And you will give us time before our exam, right? A couple of days, sir?
Of course, we'll have study time, yes.
I wonder if somebody was close the hot.
There wasn't really a lot of
It was paper, so I put
I've been having a brain fart. How do you spell facilitate?
Let's talk this
the thymus.
Thymus is T45.
So it was T4.
Yeah.